Hello and welcome. I'm Murray Griffin and you're listening to Track Changes. Today we're going to hear first up from Tony Chappel, Chief Executive of the New South Wales EPA, about the authority's new efforts to help make sure New South Wales meets its greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets. You're going to hear about what the New South Wales EPA is planning to do to make sure that the facilities that it licenses think about ways to cut emissions and share their emissions reduction plans with the public. You're going to hear how the EPA's approach will work in tandem with the federal safeguard mechanism. And I know you've all heard of carrots and sticks, but today you're also going to hear from Tony about carrot-flavoured sticks. Then we're going to get an intriguing international perspective on what EPAs can do and how others respond when those efforts are disrupted. I'm going to be talking to Carbon Pulse North America editor, Allison Gacad, who has some great insights to share on what the US EPA achieved under the Obama and Biden administrations and what's happened under the Trump administration. She'll also talk about how states are responding to the Trump administration's rollbacks. Okay, first up, let's go hear what Tony has to say. Hello, Tony, and welcome to Track Changes.
Great to be here with you, Murray.
So just to start off with, tell me a bit about your career so far and what has been a career highlight for you?
Oh gosh, I mean, I'm not a typical public servant. This is actually my first public service role, though I've been in it now for 3 years. But I spent a lot of time in the private sector and I was always very interested in sustainability and sort of helping businesses do better and do good things. And I was lucky enough sort of in my 30s to get an opportunity to do some postgrad study in the UK around environmental science and change and management, and then worked a bit in research and came back here to work for some of our sort of, well, in the EPA parlance, we call them our licensees, but you could think of them as the big polluters in various sectors, mining, gas, electricity generation, at least on the coal side as well. And so, you know, I always was coming from a point of view of how do we do this better? And then over time, I had the opportunity to move into a couple of more government or public policy roles that are trying to orchestrate that broader transformation. And I guess one thing I'm really proud of contributing to is prior to joining EPA, I was at an organization called AEMO, which is the Australian Energy Market Operator.
Yeah.
And I was an executive there for 4 years. And I sort of helped the former CEO, Audrey Zibelman, change how the organization framed and discussed and analyzed its planning documents away from a sort of what I think is really a false binary about, you know, is coal cheaper or renewables and what do you do in particular context to I guess, accepting the necessity and opportunity of what people call the energy transition, but reshaping that objective to be enabling that transition to benefit Australians and Australian consumers. So I played a role in helping, I suppose, modernise how we think about the energy transformation that is underway and bring that, I think, into a much more constructive sort of paradigm.
Which is a really important thing. I mean, how agencies, government, semi-government communicate about what they're doing and what they're thinking, I think it's really crucial. So, look, just to kick off, I guess the EPA's step up in efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by its licensees, I think had its genesis in a courtroom, namely the Land and Environment Court. I know that court decision was before your time at the EPA, but I'm sure you're familiar with it. Could you tell me about that case and about the court's findings?
Yeah, Bruno, of course. So there was a community group called Bushfire Survivors for Climate Action who sued the New South Wales EPA and sought some orders essentially requiring the EPA to act on the causes and consequences of the climate crisis. And what the Chief Justice and the court ordered through something called a mandamus order, which is really where a court requires a government agency to do something that it should be doing, was that the EPA develop plans and policies and programs to address both the causes and consequences of climate pollution. And this is because under our Act, the Protection of the Environment Administration Act, it is very clear that the EPA has a legally binding requirement to consider the causes and consequences of harm to the environment and human health caused by pollution and act to address those and get pollution to safe levels. And so the court essentially said, you've been doing that in these other you've been doing that in these other contexts of water pollution, noise, air pollution, odor. You need to do it in terms of greenhouse gases as well.
Yeah, which was a very significant decision. It did prompt a bit of a rethink at the EPA. I think that's definitely fair to say. What did that decision prompt the EPA to do? And take me through the steps that you took in the lead up to releasing this new draft guidance.
Yeah, no, look, it absolutely did. And I think part of the challenge, the EPA, I think, probably understood that it had an ability to treat greenhouse gas pollution as it was dealing with other pollution, but there's this concept of a sort of authorizing environment in the public service, even in independent agencies. And I suppose for a period of time, the EPA didn't feel it had that sort of authorizing environment. But when you have a court order, that sort of creates the authorizing environment. It can be very empowering for a regulator or a government agency. And so what the EPA then set about doing was developing what we call a climate change policy and a climate change action plan that was released in 2022. And it sets out a whole series of actions that we would take to sort of build the foundational approaches for how we would look to regulate greenhouse gases. And so one of the first steps was surveying about 2,000 of our largest polluters, the businesses we license that produce air pollution of various kinds that includes greenhouse gases, about how they were approaching climate risk, resilience, adaptation, and how they were considering the transition to net zero. And that gave us an incredibly rich data set across every sector of the community and the economy. And we then used that to essentially develop tools and to start to think about new regulatory approaches sector by sector, because some of this regulatory architecture doesn't exist yet. And we need to bring it into being if we're going to be efficient and effective and do what I think all governments want to do, which is decarbonise, not deindustrialise. We actually want new sources of sort of sustainable prosperity to come to life as we transition some of the heavily polluting activities down in our economy.
Were you surprised by any of the findings of that initial survey?
Look, a little. I guess having worked in industry, anyone who's worked in sustainability in a private organization knows that if you've got the CEO on board, you can actually go a really, really long way. If you don't have that, it can often feel like you're pushing against some very strong headwinds. And what we found was really quite a small proportion of the businesses that we regulate had developed plans already. Sort of around half had thought about how they would transition to an ultimately net zero state by 2050 in some ways, and less than a quarter really had well-developed plans, including considering the resilience of their own operations, for example, to increasing extreme weather events.
Okay, so plenty of room for improvement then, which is where this new guidance comes in. So let's talk about the guidance. Give me an overview about these three new documents.
Sure. So the first one is some licensee requirements in respect of climate change. So for that full suite of a couple of thousand businesses, which covers, the lion's share of greenhouse emissions in New South Wales. It's not everything, but that's where we're starting. We regulate these businesses through pollution reduction programs, through a variety of other tools, including what's called an environment protection license. And so we're going to add a requirement to those licensees to really to start taking those first steps towards decarbonisation. So they need to start identifying, quantifying and reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions and developing a plan to reduce those emissions. And, as I mentioned, I think only about a quarter of these entities had really quantified their emissions in a granular and rigorous way. So the first step of managing something is to measure it. And that's one of the first steps we're taking there. But we're also going to require monitoring at the facility level of methane, starting with the underground mining sector, and fugitive methane, which is very difficult to measure and it's diffuse. We're looking to really contribute to the science around that so we can reduce the uncertainty about how we consider that. So there's some licensee requirements there, some of which go particularly to the mining sector, but they cover all of our licensees. The second document is the requirements for what we're calling climate change mitigation and adaptation plans.
Catchy title, Tony. Okay.
Well, yes. Look, a lot of acronyms.
I know you've got an acronym there, but
we call these CC maps. But they are, yes, there are many acronyms in policy and regulatory context, unfortunately. But this is another. But what it really does is lay out what that operation and the ultimate owner of that portfolio of operations where they have them, their current and future expected emissions, their own emission reduction goals, and the mitigation actions they're going to implement to achieve those goals. And they need to publish these regularly and update them every 3 years. And so many of our sort of ASX 100 businesses that operate here in New South Wales already have a pretty sophisticated version of this, but the vast majority of the businesses that have emissions in this space don't. So that's number 2. And then number 3 is the first of our sort of sector guidelines for mitigation. And this one, we're starting with the coal mining sector. And we intend to follow this with other sectors. The government's flagged, the New South Wales government has committed to updating the 10-year net zero transformation strategy, which will include particularly a focus on transport, built environment, and I think agriculture. So we'll work with our other colleagues in government on the carrots and sticks and what I like to call carrot-flavoured sticks of that space. But we're starting here in the coal sector, really trying to drive and enable and orchestrate on-site abatement and signal what the proposed regulations are well in advance so the market and industry can start to adjust well before they take effect. And so there's 3 specific requirements here. We're looking to require pre-drainage and flaring of gas by 2027 for underground mines. Secondly is something called ventilation air methane abatement by 2030 for underground mines, which is essentially underground mines typically extract the methane and vent it to the atmosphere, but they can obviously abate that through either using it to generate on-site power or even flaring it. It turns a greenhouse gas from methane to something still damaging to the climate, but much less impactful in terms of CO2. And then the third requirement is about low carbon fuels and setting a glide path to adopt those or other zero carbon vehicle technologies. But as low carbon fuels is a proportion of fossil diesel use at open cut and underground mines from 2030.
Shortly, we'll just go into a bit more detail on each of those documents. But I wanted to ask you first up that one thing that surprised me a little with the guidance is the centrality of sector-based approaches in the new regime, and that includes the gradual development of sector-specific greenhouse gas budgets. Tell me about your thinking there.
Well, look, it's obviously an evolving space. At the moment, New South Wales has happily legislated and in a bipartisan way a science-based target for the economy as a whole, which is we need to reduce our emissions by about half by 2030 and obviously down to zero by 2050. But sectors are different, and we're not in a world where there's sort of one economy-wide price. And so we're in a world of trying to find the next best alternative. And that does vary dramatically sector by sector. And also the available, practical, feasible technology in some sectors electricity is a great example where, right now, rooftop solar and large-scale renewables are cost competitive. As we struggle to replace the aging kind of coal-fired power fleet, the cheapest way to do that is from renewables. So that's, that technology is not only prospective, it's available now and it's economic now. There are other sectors where the technology is further off on the horizon or it's coming. We see this with some of the green metals technologies that are under development. And there's a version of that in most sectors. So we need to treat sectors differently, and we can't expect them all to necessarily decarbonize at exactly the same rate. They've all got to make a contribution. But it's also acknowledging, I think, the reality that some of the regulatory architecture that will best fit, it doesn't exist yet. And we need to develop that through a deeply collaborative process, with value chains, with supply chain captains, with other stakeholders as well, the community and scientific sources of advice that we seek to tap as well. So we need to think very hard sector by sector to be both efficient and effective.
Okay, and I guess that will sort of tie in a bit with the federal government's, sectoral net zero plans to some extent as well.
Yeah, I mean, they'll broadly be, I think, consistent. I think where states typically do better is we're much more experienced and comfortable getting down to the granular detail and trying to find the right way to sort of meet the sustainable development imperative in other contexts, and this will be no different. We need to do it here as well.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's do a bit of a deep dive now on the 3 bits of guidance. And firstly, the licensee requirements, the climate change licensee requirements. They would be phased in to apply to about 200 premises that each have operational greenhouse gas emissions of more than 25,000 tonnes.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of facilities would be covered by that threshold, and what sort of facilities wouldn't be?
So at this point, where we're starting here is, as you've said, we've identified about 200 licensees that are over a 25,000 tonne scope 1 and 2 sort of emissions profile annually. So that's about 10% of that broader set of 2,000 facilities, but it's what you might consider the most material businesses that are not necessarily captured by the safeguard mechanism.
Yeah.
And that includes things like coal mines and large industrial facilities, large manufacturers, and some large agricultural facilities like feedlots, and also some of our large landfills in New South Wales. So that 200 subset emits about 90% of the emissions from all of the licensed businesses that we currently regulate, and so that you can think of that as about 50% of the scope 1 emissions in New South Wales.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're not, for example, at this point capturing housing developments, some of those small landfills or sewage plants, or food and beverage facilities that are below those thresholds.
Yeah. Fair enough. One of the requirements in that guide is that these facilities prepare annual climate change emissions reports. Will the data in that report pretty much match, what these facilities report, or some of these facilities report through the federal NGA scheme, which is the Federal Emissions and Energy Reporting Scheme? And what's the purpose of that requirement?
So, well, you're right. Some of the larger emitters do report their emissions to the Clean Energy Regulator through that federal scheme. Not all of the information that they report is published, though. And the purpose of these reports is really to provide consistent, reliable data that allows the EPA to track emissions, to benchmark performance, to make robust sort of evidence-based decisions, and improve transparency and accountability on emissions for the broader public. So we are currently able to access a lot of that confidential data from the Clean Energy Regulator under some data sharing arrangements, but it remains confidential, and we're quite limited in sort of how we can use that data, and certainly being able to talk about it publicly. So to be an effective regulator, we do need to have the kind of comprehensive access to greenhouse gas data for the facilities that we are licensing, and we obviously want to be transparent to the community about pollution levels and any associated risk. And so what we're asking the licensees to submit to us is the same data that if they're covered by the Clean Energy Regulator, and with some additions. And what we'll be able to do then is have a clear baseline for New South Wales licensees. We'll be able to compare across facilities, identify trends, and over time we want to be publishing this information so communities, investors and other stakeholders can see how facilities are performing. And we're actually, to avoid duplication, we're working on a data sharing arrangement with the Clean Energy Regulator so that if facilities are covered by that regulation, they can just submit their information once and it will go through a portal to both the Clean Energy Regulator and ourselves.
All right. Oh, that's a high degree of integration. I mean, people have complained about the level of secrecy in the NGA scheme. There's some very useful public data there, but as you said, it's not that comprehensive. So this would actually provide, a lot more data that people are already collecting, but that's just sitting in, under lock and key within the Clean Energy Regulator. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah. Okay. So the first guidance document also flags the introduction of climate change mitigation and adaptation plans, the CC maps that you mentioned earlier, and those would have to be updated every 3 years. The second draft guidance document describes what needs to be in these plans. Can you talk me through what the second guidance document says needs to be included?
Yeah, absolutely. So the licensees will need to prepare a climate change mitigation and adaptation plan and publish this on their corporate website and update it every 3 years. And the CC map is going to outline their current and 10-year future sort of emissions profile, what their emissions reduction goals are, what any on-site mitigation actions they're proposing to use to achieve that are. And we really want these plans focused on reducing on-site emissions. So offsets are, of course, able to be used, including with the safeguard mechanism, but they're really as a last resort. So we're establishing a clear hierarchy for mitigation, which we also built into the new planning guidelines for any major emissions-intensive proposal seeking planning approval. A bit like people will be familiar with the waste hierarchy where we try to, reduce, reuse, recycle, and then ultimately recover material and before it goes to landfill. We want businesses to be thinking hard about avoidance and then, mitigation and abatement and ultimately offsets come at the end of that thought process. So really we're looking for meaningful operational changes that businesses can consider to reduce the generation of emissions or substitute materials, or lower emission sources before they think through the offsets piece. And obviously it's got to be practical and feasible, but that's the thinking that we'd like to sort of help businesses evolve into doing.
Yeah. I imagine that quite a few companies, they might find this first time around a bit of a pain, but in fact, a lot of them are going to find them really useful because they're going to be, their major customers, particularly their big customers, will be seeking exactly the same kind of information. So if they've got these plans that they can just flick along to, to their major customers, that's going to be really useful for them, I would have thought.
No, that's right. And it's also increasingly going to be important for market access where trading blocks or countries have some level of carbon border adjustment. But the other point that I think is critical to make is in a business, you focus on your biggest costs and your biggest revenues. And often the thing that's creating the emissions is not necessarily correlated to one of those biggest costs. But when you look at it, it can be a very material opportunity to reduce cost or create revenue, but to essentially improve the bottom line performance. And so our sort of observed experience of this globally is that as businesses actually engage in this more deeply, they almost immediately start to reduce their emissions by 5 to 10%, and they do that in a way that actually is usually revenue accretive.
Yes. So, I think a lot of them are going to be and are going to end up being very grateful that that they had to go down this path. So I'm a big fan of the New South Wales EPA package in its entirety, but especially of these plans. And it's because they will be public and they will be standardised, which I think is really important. I know some companies will probably come back and say, "Oh, we do a sustainability report," but the sustainability reports are, they're not concise and they're not easily comparable. The plans are a bit like something that the Clean Energy Regulator used to run for a while. I can't remember I think it was called the CERT scheme. It was sort of a voluntary emissions reporting program. I was a big fan of that too, but it never really took off. But one difference between that scheme that the Clean Energy Regulator ran and the plans that you will be requiring licensees to develop is that you want to see emissions forecasts for a decade out, and you want to see planned mitigation measures for a decade out. What's the importance of having that information and making it public?
Oh, well, look, it's very important. I mean, the 10-year horizon is critical because companies make decisions that lock in particular outcomes for investments and new equipment or processes. And so the trajectory needs to consider that sort of investment horizon if it's going to be meaningful. And we also, over time, want to see how companies are aligning to the long-term net zero goal. It's not just about box ticking or short-term compliance. So, a lot of businesses don't think 25 years ahead, but I think when they do, it's inevitably quite a useful approach to take for their own planning as well.
Yeah.
And, as you point out, some of these reports can be almost a box ticking exercise. But what's really useful, I think, for the business and for us, as well as for the community, is to have in a transparent, comparable way of understanding, laying out where emissions are heading and how they are planned to be reduced. And because these plans will be public and standardised, that visibility itself will be another driver for genuine emissions reduction.
Yeah. No, I think they're a great move, and they will, as you say, a lot of companies won't have thought on these planning horizons. 10 years is something that they should be able to do. They should be able to make those forecasts, and they should be able to think about mitigation measures, but a lot of them probably won't have done so. I mean, some of them will, as you found in your initial survey, but a lot of them, I imagine, won't have done so. And so, this will be a really useful exercise for them, for their own purposes, and for discovering what's possible for themselves. So let's go on to the third bit of guidance, which I'm intrigued by, a greenhouse gas mitigation guide for New South Wales coal mines. So tell me about this document. And I'm sort of interested. I mean, you did describe it a bit at the top there, but can you just describe, how you're going to introduce these coal requirements? Is it going to be through licenses or in some other way? And can you elaborate a bit on the proposals for ventilation air methane?
Yes,
and potentially for biodiesel, and just maybe ventilation air methane. If you to give you just hurl a whole lot of confusing stuff at you, but if you could also just briefly explain the challenges of ventilation air methane as well.
Yeah, of course. So, look, we're consulting on these now with the industry, and the way they will ultimately be implemented, it could be a couple of different directions. We could codify these requirements in individual licenses, or the government may prefer to develop a regulation that sort of just applies across the sector. So we need to kind of understand the feedback and just think a bit more deeply about the most efficient way to progressively create these kind of requirements, what the right legal instrument is. But what we're essentially trying to do is outline specific requirements for reducing the major sources of direct Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions from coal mines. And those are fugitive methane, and they're also emissions from the combustion of fossil diesel fuel. In an open cut mine, it can be about 50% of each. Of course, there are some parts of the state where there's very little methane in the coal, but in other parts, there's quite a lot. And then for underground mines, the methane that concentrates underground and is released is usually the very, very much the lion's share of the emissions. But they're both, material sources of pollution for the sector. And as we all know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's got a short atmospheric lifetime. So taking action here also helps us create more headroom to do those harder to abate sectors as well. We also know, for example, diesel combustion products, they do have a human health impact. And so they also contain, other climate pollutants that are often short-lived. So there's the specific requirements we're proposing to reduce fugitive methane, the pre-draining and flaring of methane gas by 2027 at underground mines, and then addressing methane leaks from old workings by 2027 at underground mines, and then installing ventilation air methane abatement technology by 2030 for underground mines. And, for the diesel emissions, we're looking to see the vehicle fleets operating, transitioning to low carbon fuels as a proportion of fossil diesel use at all of our mines from 2030. And transitioning to sort of zero emission alternative vehicles from 2040. So there's some general guidance for minor sources of Scope 1 emissions like ammonium nitrate, fuel oil, and some guidance on the Scope 2 side, which I think mainly is most effectively done through purchasing zero carbon electricity. And on Scope 3 or other indirect emissions generated in the wider economy with the activity of mining. So the ventilation air methane, or VAM, and biodiesel are two of the technologies that we think are highly prospective and feasible for the sector. Now, every mine is different, and that's important to acknowledge. But there are underground coal mines in other jurisdictions in Asia and North America that use ventilation air methane now. When we look at the New South Wales sector, fugitive methane is about 70% of the total Scope 1 emissions, and about 80% of that comes from underground mines. And so one of the technologies that we're keen to consult deeply now with the sector on is what we call VAM, which essentially captures and then destroys the methane that is produced and otherwise vents to the atmosphere through underground mining. Now, we're looking closely at some different abatement trials here and in Queensland, and we're working closely with the safety regulator in the mining space, which is in New South Wales, it's the resources regulator, because there is concern about various safety elements and timeframes from the sector. We need to work through all of that and validate sort of the hypothesis that we hold. But that's what we're doing over the next few months. Should I talk about diesel, or do you want to talk more about that?
No, let's talk about diesel.
Well, just in terms of diesel combustion, the requirements are a bit different. So on average, I think about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions from coal mines comes from diesel emissions. And we want mines to eventually transition to zero emissions machinery on their sites. And we're proposing to start this transition with a 5% zero carbon fuel requirement by 2030, with the percentage increasing over time up to 25% by 2050, and where mines are also required to commence transitioning to zero emissions machinery from 2040. Now, obviously, mines have their own capital cycle. We don't currently regulate diesel fuel efficiency, so one of the other actions that we've been rolling out is to introduce modern sort of North American, European standard diesel efficiency requirements. But we know that there is a quite a vibrant biofuel sector already in Australia, and there's a lot of capacity there. The sector's quite confident they can meet these mandates and grow, but we're really trying to catalyse that supply chain by signalling these mandates are coming, and that in turn will boost production and lower the cost.
Yes, it'll be very interesting to watch and very exciting to watch. Let's zoom out a bit now to the package overall. I'm interested in what sort of reaction you've been getting from companies when you talk to them about these changes. Do any of them sort of, look at you and say, "Well, what took you so long?" Or do any of them say, "You'll do this over my dead body"? I mean, what's the sort of gamut of reactions that you get?
Look, it is mixed, and there's definitely a spectrum of reactions. Some do see these nudges as long overdue, and others are quite cautious about the detail and, the feasibility of the timelines. And, of course, in an ideal world, we would have been starting all of this stuff decades ago, but we are encouraged that the whole industry is engaging very constructively, and that's what's going to help us land the package to make sure that it is ambitious but also practical. And we've been working on these proposals for the best part of 12 months. The EPA set up some climate change advisory groups, one for the mining sector and one for the agricultural sector. And we also have all the other New South Wales government agencies feeding into that. And so that has given us a really good platform with stakeholder insights to inform these proposals, and we've tried to validate them through some expert technical panels as well. So, we looked at the supply chain, we've talked to the providers of a lot of this technology, and the other interesting part is, as another part of the net zero roadmap, the New South Wales government's developing a renewable fuels strategy. So a lot of that insight has helped us inform how we've thought about these renewable fuel mandates as well.
Oh, okay. Yep. All right. So a sort of a pretty wide gamut of a pretty wide range of reactions there. At the federal level, we do have the safeguard mechanism, which applies to very large emitters. In other words, it applies to just over 200 facilities that emit more than 100,000 tonnes of greenhouse gas a year. That's scope 1. How could the New South Wales scheme that the EPA has developed or is developing, how will that interact with the safeguard? And how far could that interaction go? I mean, could the EPA ever become an agency that helps licensees earn ACCUs from their mitigation actions and sell them to safeguard entities, maybe a broker? To me, there seems like lots of interaction potential, and I'll be keen to get your thoughts on it all.
Yeah, look, potentially some of these actions, as businesses take them, will generate very significant quantities of ACCUs through on-site abatement. I suppose we've tried to take a very carefully considered approach to complement the safeguard, and we've been working nationally. There's a group called the Heads of EPAs for Australia and New Zealand who meet a couple of times a year, and we have a community of practice in climate regulation, which we started to bring in other regulators from North America and Europe and Asia to have a great dialogue about how these things are done most efficiently. And we've also tried to agree some nationally consistent principles on alignment to the safeguard mechanism.
I saw those come out, from
so
EPA
I think 3
Victoria.
or 4 states, Victoria, South Australia, ACT, and we're obviously engaging with the other states as well. But the 4 of us have sort of made that public commitment. And I think the most practical difference, or the way to think about the difference and the complementarity, is the safeguard doesn't require on-site emission reductions. And for many sectors, it uses an average. There are many facilities that have material emissions, but which are their emissions are below that average. And so they're actually sort of creating credits through kind of business as usual. And over time,
these are the safeguard credits that you're talking about.
Yes. And over time, those allowances decline. But New South Wales, as where I started with our science-based targets, we require a level of transformation that's a bit faster than what the national target currently is. And obviously, ultimately, that will align by 2050. But we have in our law enshrined a 50% reduction by 2030 and 70% by 2035. And so we want to see as much of that as possible, as is as effective and efficient, is through on-site abatement and the innovation that comes from that and the economic benefits that come from that, rather than simply, seeking to purchase ACCUs to meet a facility's obligations. And so anything a facility does to improve on-site abatement will potentially produce credits they can use or sell to other safeguard participants or others. But these requirements in terms of the abatement and the hierarchy, and then also the reporting and publishing of emissions reduction plans, we think that's very complementary to achieving the objectives the Commonwealth has under the safeguard, and it's obviously also consistent with the law here in New South Wales.
Yeah. Okay. I do want to talk about this a bit more because I think there'll be a lot of interest in it. But one thing is I've got two questions. So firstly, if you make this so you can encourage maybe at a sector level or whatever, mitigation actions, and then there's no problem, I would have thought, generating ACCUs. If they're in licenses as conditions, I think that changes the story a bit, but you could sort of enlighten me a bit on that and whether that's relevant to your thinking in any way. And the other thing I wanted to ask you is that there is a lot of talk about, which the federal government is resisting, at least so far, about lowering the threshold for participation in the safeguard to 25,000 tonnes of Scope 1 emissions or more. It would seem to me that if the New South Wales scheme goes ahead, which I hope it will, that sort of, frankly, does a better job than the safeguard ever could at picking up that cohort of emitters that are still fairly big time, but not like the big end of town. So two questions there. Firstly, the issue of ACCU generation and sort of relevance to whether conditions are imposed through licenses or sort of, soft power or, I don't know, guidance or whatever, and whether that's relevant to the thinking at all or not. And then the other question of, can you guys regulate mid-tier emitters better than the clean energy regulator?
But look, I think the states generally are more effective at the sort of operational delivery of policy and regulation, just because we are closer to the community or the businesses. So that's sort of a general principle, but obviously national consistency and national leadership is very important. And you're right, there are so you need a specific method that's approved by the Clean Energy Regulator to create, ACCUs through abatement projects. And New South Wales has proposed a new methodology, which I think is under sort of consideration at the moment in terms of reducing the intensity of native forest harvesting. That we're looking forward to see how the emissions assurance and integrity process lands on that. But that's potentially a new source of credits here in New South Wales. And then there's the additionality requirement generally under ACCUs. So they generally, if something's required by a law, it won't generate ACCUs. So the way I think a lot of these facilities can capitalize on this would be moving ahead of any binding regulatory requirements. And what we're trying to do is signal these are coming in and set the ultimate. I mean, this is part of, we like to talk about carrot-flavored sticks at the EPA.
Yeah, look, tell me about it. That's a great move, by the way, saying this is coming down the track. So if you actually want to make money out of, extra money out of your mitigation action, then do it now and register it as an ACCU project. I really like that. That's very clever. But you're putting this under the rubric of this term that, I don't know if I used rubric correctly there, but you're putting it under the umbrella of this term I've heard you talk about before, which is a carrot-flavored stick. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so look, in there are a lot of old school bureaucrats who will tell you that, regulation should be utterly separate from policy making and thinking, and because otherwise there's a conflict. And there is certainly there are challenges with a model that doesn't separate the two. But when you are trying to orchestrate system level change, which we are both in terms of decarbonisation, but also creating a safe circular economy, all of the evidence is that the regulation, the policy and the programs and everything else should be as joined up as possible, because otherwise they, operate against each other. And so that's one of the wonderful things in New South Wales at the moment is, with my colleagues in the department, we're able to bring the full gamut of sort of state tools to bear on this challenge and think really creatively sector by sector about what I like to call carrots and sticks, and also carrot-flavoured sticks. And so going back to the methane abatement challenge in coal mining, so the government has had very substantial money on the table for a number of years now for a mine to take up this investment and demonstrate the safety and efficacy and essentially to move in that regard. But there's lots of other reasons why the capital planning horizon doesn't necessarily line up to incentivize that, or the planning consent, or if you've got an externality that's being vented to the environment and there's no immediate cost or no imminent cost, you don't really have any need to move. But if you know regulation's coming, the way you might think about taking up that government incentive will change, a bit like we were talking about moving faster to create ACCUs to try and monetize that abatement. If there's money on the table to de-risk a capital investment, it's a lot more attractive to take it up if you know that in 5 years or 10 years or at some point in time, you're going to have to be having made that investment. And so to me, that's a great example of regulation and policy coming together to hopefully orchestrate the system change that we all know we need to make, but to do it in a way that moves, with some speed and also efficiency.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, it gives people certainty, which they crave. I mean, the Productivity Commission recently pointed that out in their interim net zero report. It creates pressure for things to be done faster. And and I do agree that I think, I'm a big fan of the clean energy regulator, but I do think state EPAs, if they're together enough, and New South Wales clearly is, are better at providing that balance of information, grants, and regulation to bring it all together. So I think I'll be very keen to see how this all plays out. We're sort of almost at the end. I know your time's almost up, but I just had two more questions. One is a general question about communications, and you talked about your time at AEMO at the start and sort of repositioning how AEMO spoke about what it was doing, how it talked to the public about what it was doing. And one of the things I've noticed about the New South Wales EPA is that it's very good at setting its proposals in the right context when it's talking about potential changes. It's clear in the way the EPA talks about these greenhouse gas changes, where it talks about the fact that that EPA licensees contribute between 50% and 60% of New South Wales greenhouse gas emissions. And it was clear, for example, in the way the EPA spoke about waste reforms, where it said, well, if we don't fix this up, we're going to have to open some old landfills that are currently closed. So what are your thoughts on how regulators can best communicate with their constituencies?
That is a great question, and it's one of the hardest things to do because these are wicked problems and they're very complicated, and people we know are more and more time poor and their attention span is harder and harder to capture. I actually think there's some lessons from our Aboriginal heritage and, the first Australians that we all inherit. that are useful here. And there's this concept of deep listening that we talk about a lot at the EPA, which is very much a sort of Aboriginal cultural concept that when you meet someone, you engage very deeply about understanding who they are and what they're doing in the place, and they do the same for you before you get down to any business or transaction. And so when we talk to industry in the community, we very much try to front-end load it with that. But then having done that listening, we try and bring that insight together to explain, if we believe action is required, what the alternatives look like. Because obviously people have different views, that's very legitimate. But, in the waste and circular economy space, the alternative to doing all the things that the government is now doing around planning and recycling and separating out organics and plastic and the container deposit scheme being expanded, the alternative to that is more landfill capacity or more cost, or, in a worst case scenario, we run out of capacity and the bins aren't collected for a period of time, which would obviously be catastrophic. So it's important, I think, when you're talking about a system change, to explain what the alternatives to that are. And for us, the best way to understand the mindset of the people we need to communicate with is through that deep listening, which historically government or the private sector hasn't been particularly great at, but it's a muscle we're trying to build.
Yep. Okay, well, thanks for that. That's a very good answer. I just have one last question, which is a standard question that I ask every guest. And it's this: what fact do you wish was more widely known because it would help us to move faster to a cleaner, greener, better world?
Oh, I think the air quality benefit of electrifying transport is phenomenal. If you look at the reduction in lung cancer and other disease, particularly amongst, low socioeconomic groups who often have their housing right on busy intersections and major roads, you can plot the particulate and SOx and NOx pollution by how close it is to these major roads. So aside from the climate benefit, electrifying transport has huge public health benefits, and I don't think we talk about that nearly enough.
Yeah. Okay. Another great answer. So Tony Chappel, thanks very much.
Murray, it's been my pleasure. I'm happy to talk anytime, and thanks for engaging on these issues.
That was a great chat with Tony Chappel, and you might have picked up there that a potentially important co-benefit of the EPA proposals is that the new requirements will create a significant source of demand from EPA licence holders for Australian carbon credit units, or ACCUs as they're known, especially ACCUs created in New South Wales. And one potential source of those ACCUs is projects linked to the cessation of native forest logging in public forest that becomes part of the New South Wales Great Koala National Park. It's very good policy making. Okay, now we're heading to Vancouver to chat with Carbon Pulse North America editor Allison Gacad to get an international perspective on what EPAs can do. Allison closely follows developments in both the US and Canada, and today she's going to tell us about the US EPA. Allison, thanks very much for joining us. You've been covering North American EPA developments for a long time. We have just come off the back of a chat with Tony Chappel from the New South Wales EPA in Australia, and they're doing some quite groundbreaking work on regulating greenhouse gas emissions. To start off with, could you tell us how it came about that the US EPA stepped up on climate change several years ago, I think in the Obama administration? And could you tell us the impact that intervention by the EPA had on efforts by the US to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, first off, thanks so much for having me, Marie. The story of how the US EPA has come to regulate greenhouse gas emissions is an interesting one. It happened slowly at first, and then it kind of dismantled very quickly, unfortunately, as we've seen this year. But starting off from the foundations, really, as you mentioned, so in 2009, the Obama administration, so the EPA under former President Barack Obama, established something called the endangerment finding. And that was a landmark piece of, that was a landmark rule in a sense, in that it was the EPA stamping across that greenhouse gases do threaten public health and welfare. And what that essentially did was give permission to federal agencies to regulate greenhouse gases. So from aircrafts, cars, heavy-duty trucks, power producers, etc. But one thing that is important to note is that this wasn't something that the EPA just kind of came up with on its own. It came about as a result of significant pressure from the states. It was actually in, I think the ruling was in 2007, but it was a Supreme Court decision that came about because the state of Massachusetts, alongside 11 other states and cities in the US, sued the EPA at the time, which was under the George W. Bush administration. And they sued the EPA on the basis that the EPA should be regulating greenhouse gases. And the Supreme Court decision in 2007 ruled in favor of Massachusetts. And as a result, the EPA was then required by law to start regulating greenhouse gases. And then that led to the 2009 endangerment finding, and that essentially provided the foundation for environmental regulation under the EPA. And since then, the Obama administration, I'd say he was out of office in 2016 and was able to stamp through a lot of many methane standards, specifically focused on landfill emissions, oil and gas producers. And then when Trump came into office for the first time in 2017, he challenged a lot of those and successfully rolled them back. But it was a bit of a tit for tat because when Biden was elected in office, after the first Trump administration, those methane standards were then brought back. And when Biden came back in that period of time, he kind of came back in full force and also introduced a few other different measures. So he introduced vehicle standards, which were essentially the emission standards that would regulate the greenhouse gases coming out of vehicles and the types of vehicles that would be sold in the US. The EPA under the Biden administration also came up with the social cost of carbon, which was a really important a really important rule in that it provided an estimate of economic damages associated with emitting 1 ton of CO2. So it put a dollar amount to carbon pollution. And I'd say that the primary pieces of EPA, I guess, rules that were put in place by former President Biden before Trump, as we said in our reporting, took a wrecking ball to environmental regulation.
Yes.
Yeah, there's also quite a bit that happened on the funding side, but we can stick to regulations for now and maybe chat about that in a different question or at some point.
Yeah. It's interesting. I hadn't realized that the US EPA's take-up of climate change as an issue stemmed from litigation, which is exactly the same as in New South Wales. What the New South Wales EPA basically stood on the sidelines until there was a court case in the New South Wales case launched by an environmental group. And that just transformed the way the EPA engaged on these issues. And clearly the same kind of thing happened in the US. It's comforting in a way to know that litigation can be so effective in bringing agencies into play. And I guess particularly comforting to know that given the recent International Court of Justice ruling on climate change as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is New South Wales typically a litigious state, or Australia broadly? I ask because covering American climate policies, it seems like there are lawsuits left, right, and center. And that is kind of how the needle is moved in a sense when it comes to regulating greenhouse gases. It seems like these days.
It is true, isn't it? I mean, I do think that there is a lot of climate change litigation in Australia, strategic litigation, with, mixed success. But when it is successful, it does have a very big impact. And even when it's not, it can still trigger incremental change. Yes. Okay. Well, we can't put it off any longer. tell us what's happened now that the Trump administration is in charge. What has happened with respect to the EPA's powers and obligations to regulate greenhouse gas emissions?
I'd say that probably the month of March was our busiest reporting period of time because it seemed like the EPA was just announcing all of these different policies that it was rolling back. So as I mentioned earlier, a wrecking ball to environmental regulations. So the policies that I mentioned on power plant standards, greenhouse gas reporting programs, the endangerment finding. In March, the EPA put a big announcement essentially saying that we're going to take a look at all of this and we're hoping that the outcome of our review is that these won't exist, in essence. In a parallel motion, what happened was that the EPA also terminated a lot of grant funding that they had been allocating in years prior due to the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act that gave a huge pot of money to the EPA. It was about $27 billion to emissions reductions projects in the US with a special focus on low-income and disadvantaged communities. And in the same month, March of this year, 2025, the EPA under the Trump administration terminated all of that funding seemingly overnight. It's been battled in the courts, really back and forth between the groups who were promised funding and hadn't received it, and the EPA. And as a result of not receiving funding, obviously layoffs ensued. And the courts have, as of recent, ruled in favor of the EPA. But given that America is such a litigious country, they are anticipating to go back and forth on this in a over the next few years, I can imagine. But that being said, the damage in a sense is already done in that many of these nonprofits and projects that were promised funding haven't been able to receive it, haven't been able to pay their workers that work in communities to reduce emissions, whether that's solar programs, renewables programs, community education campaigns. That work isn't being done. A third item that's taken place, less EPA and more from a federal Department of Justice perspective, is actually from kind of the Trump executive order parlance himself, in that he's threatened to go after state efforts to reduce emissions. He put out an executive order that many lawyers that I'd spoken to said, mostly reads like a press release saying that they're going to sue states that take initiative to take action on climate to reduce emissions. He really wasn't a fan of carbon markets and wanted to go after those too. And the whole country and states have just kind of been on watch since that April executive order came out, trying to see what will the Department of Justice, what kind of lawsuit could they possibly unleash upon a state or a local government or a different level of government with regards to their climate action. Surprisingly, we haven't seen too much litigation actually since that April executive order, but we have seen, kind of in a similar vein, Trump's outright canceled, for example, wind projects that are happening on the east coast of the US. So these are projects, a really significant one recently was Revolution Wind with Danish developer Ørsted. That was very, very close to completion. And Trump essentially signed off saying that this project can't go through. So wind appears to be a particular sticking point for the Trump administration. And maybe the last comment I'll make in terms of what else we've seen recently, and again, this isn't EPA, but the Department of Energy is a recent report that that really shocked a lot of the climate community and climate science community, in the sense of the DOE funded a report and commissioned a select group of scientists who have all published work as climate skeptics in essence, and the report cast doubt on the role of CO2 in causing climate change. And this report has a DOE stamp of approval. It has the the US the US stamp of approval all over it, and it's something that the DOE has confidently backed in terms of a document, and many scientists are now coming out and saying that this is very much a minority opinion, and it's long been established that CO2 causes climate change and we need to do something about it. So as of recent, I'd say that those are probably the recent rollbacks and drama that's been coming out of the Trump administration with regards to climate action and figuring out how to reduce greenhouse gases.
Yeah, both very destructive. I mean, to some extent, Australia has gone through what's now happening federally in the US, in that, we had federally a strong set of climate policies introduced in 2012 and then axed by an incoming government in 2014. So we feel the pain, we sympathise. We were lucky in that states took up the slack as much as they could. But what you're saying is that this is a federal government. The Trump administration is determined to try and prevent that happening at the state level, to sort of undermine those schemes as well. What are the chances of success there?
Yeah, that's right. It depends on the state. I think that there's some states that the Trump administration are targeting more so than others. So one, namely, is California. California has established itself as a leader in greenhouse gas emissions reductions and climate policy, and has really stood up against the Trump administration in many regards. I think a good example of this is in California's vehicle emission standards. California set some really ambitious targets to phase out the sale of gasoline or internal combustion engine vehicles or gasoline-powered vehicles in favor, obviously, of transitioning to electric vehicles in the near future, 2030, 2035. And that's something that the Trump administration it wasn't really a fan of. And so California has something called waivers from the Clean Air Act, which essentially means that California was granted permission to impose their own emission standards for vehicles that were actually more stringent than the federal government's. And Trump took it upon himself this year to note that California had this ability and essentially wanted to revoke this ability. And the only way he could revoke that ability was through Congress. And Congress voted similarly to revoke the waiver, obviously in very thin margins, just given the splits between Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Congress. But nonetheless, Congress also agreed to get rid of California's ability to impose its vehicle emission standards. Trump signed that off into law, and now it's effectively, in the eyes of Congress and the Trump administration, illegal for California to be imposing its own vehicle emission standards. California is very much standing up against that. They've put in their own lawsuit challenging the Department of the federal government, the Department of Justice for declaring that illegal. But it really remains to be seen in terms of what are the consequences, right? It's one thing for this to be declared illegal in Congress, potentially be declared illegal in the courts, but whether car manufacturers are going to act on these developments is really what will determine whether California can continue to be a leader in the electric vehicle transition and in phasing out gasoline-powered cars. So in this case, it is about state leadership, but it's also an example of the private sector and how willing are they to act. Are they on the side of California, or are they on the side of the U.S. government? And at the end of the day, car manufacturers aren't only building for the state of California. They're also building for all of the other 49 states and all around the world as well, of course. And I think that these producers find themselves now in a difficult position where the lines are a little bit blurry in terms of what's legal and what's not, and what's going to stick around in terms of emissions reductions policies in the near future.
Thank you so much, Allison, for sharing your insights.
Thank you so much, Murray.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, you can help share it by rating it on your favorite podcast platform. It's that simple. See you next time.